Okay, I presume everybody has the one I see because it was sent out like a little bit ago. Yeah? Yes. Perfect. Okay. Everybody good? Momentum gathers and something shifts. It opens an unknown horizon. An electric charge builds, pulsates through and around us as we convene for deliberation. In 1957, Morton Grotz coined the term tipping points to describe white flight, the phenomenon where black families moving into a neighborhood cause white people to leave. These imperceptible molecular shifts agitate a tipping trajectory that continues to match the urban's unsafe, unholy, and unwhite, paving the way for molar responses, organized abandonment, redlining, and policing. This was never about any individual black family, but the threat that black itself posed to the white world. Decades later, in 2014, Time magazine released a cover featuring Laverne Cox in the title "The Transgender Tipping Point: America's Next Civil Rights Frontier." This tipping point indicated not a movement of existing bodies, but a paradigm shift in embodiment itself, indexing the improvisational modes to translate into a noble frame, intent to linearize behavior, to ensure the reproduction of well-behaved families and workers written into the social code. This hierarchy mattering set the limits for trans politics firmly within the realm of quantification, where one must count to matter, a political topography that needs the bodies of black trans women and trans women of color as matter to constitute the transgender tipping point. This is why in Time's interview with Laverne Cox, she never spoke the words "America's Next Civil Rights Frontier," but her image could nevertheless be used as a potent sign of the coming future perfect, and also a particularly unlivable life to confirm the legitimacy of existing hierarchies of political matter and deny the possibilities of life otherwise. In 2019, Scientific American once again published an article about tipping points. This time described coral reefs facing a planetary ecological crisis. The looming future of climate tipping points augured unknown horizons, set the conditions for encountering the teleological emergency, abandonment, and defense. This crisis is both a cause and effect of its own elaboration, both already here and still on the horizon, signaling impending end to this world. With the foreclosure of future tipping points, signal and the collective imagination did not begin in 2019. The project of worlding requires the end of uncountable worlds. Coral bleaching disproportionately occurs in former colonial territories. The retroactive effect of colonization's ecological and social demise. The mythology of tipping points is a capacity to name crisis that remains properly endowed with human. The molarization of a constitutive molecular violence. Tipping points cannot be named as such until violence comes back to haunt the world constructed by and for the human. This resolution is constructed to the same capacity to name where the crisis of our debates occur, that coheres the rhetorical assemblage of our communities. Here, this problem of human and non-human seems more relevant than ever. File 22. Tipping points index both threat and vulnerability under conditions of colonial racism. Tipping point became commonplace in the 1950s as precursor to white flight, limited logic racist psychology. Tipping points also marked the destruction of forward order. The community is a state of emergency. The worth of funds on the onwards of the other translated started triad through categories of inclusion. We must read these kinds of current announcements and another tipping point. This interaction teaches us about risk, ability, regeneration, thinking, transparency, also what considered human, that is interactions with non-human world. Transversality is a method that informs this conversation. Trans allows for understanding that there is more than either or cross-pollination. Remember, transversality tends to explode communication across the net at every level. The ecological direction and destruction exceeds the principle of logic of crisis. The tipping point of pollution and warming is already here, still on the rise. Constituents, logical planners, the tipping point of American cities. Always about pleasing to us that this trans tipping point has become top popular, talking about for a new wave of social service, and the coral tipping point is also different. We can conceptualize coral bleaching, ecological direction is effective one way, that it is whirling emerges without even effects, strength or economic utility. You can cause more to become big business, projects with their argument of benefits against tipping point, economic logics, environmental sciences, intended by racial sexual imagining, the collective unconscious of difference making substance tipping points. In 2016, coral made use of sunlight, returning coral to cool reefs. This regeneration follows a different logic than diversity, intimating a different relation between climatic structure capacity for new head. You may find attention having the others, reading presence alongside black trans light matter, and disclose gender classes in place of declare death and defense of investments and their continued utility. Hierarchies of political matter informed by the vast effect of metabolism cohere the climate crisis and shape our political responses, from calls to militarize and lock down the southern border to demands for HRT bans to the carbon footprint of transition, shoring up an imperial home as a crisis necessary to ensure the world unbounded. This crisis of fascism bundles seemingly contradictory movements, solidarity, spheres, and context, climate, politics, autonomy, and sovereignty, authoritarian politics of administrating sex and gender to produce and battle and maintain a hierarchy of political matter. Trump's election was not a tipping point, but a demonstration of the power of the fascist effect of metabolism of the protracted racial and gender project. As Iowa eliminates dorm floors housing black, queer, and trans students, and Trump locates gender ideology alongside DEI as un-American indoctrination, it becomes clear that there's something about these ethically laden modes of political matter that gesture towards the unsustainability of the racial colonial order, which was being made and remade at the level of the everyday. Crime 24. Trans people broadly are imagined by the far right as a resource for implementing white nationalist energy. Trans encompassing gender as a racialized technique of state power social organization, includes everything: unemployment, housing, policing, criminalization, direct interpersonal violence, intensity, scope, anti-gender, spark, rendering trans techniques as a form of nationalist energy. Analytic energy draws linkages between those whose lives are rendered expendable in the rhetorical process of power as agreements into authoritarian control. For example, Dawson purges exclusion from protection of content neutrality. Singular trying to remake the world through designs, attachment, white supremacist, patriarchal, social order, and environmental destruction. Web smash energizing, link national struggles over gender, trans techniques, travels, and transplants affects in a new reader space direction, sentiment, affect, and housing tracks, relations of energy, resource fatalities, ignition, combustion, exhaustion, expandability, change, labor, racialized labor, themselves or people's resource production of newly rich exhaustion to transform its racial purpose values, also stories, social reproduction, the planetary capture, translate, our cast transcends nature, political solidified divide, order these narratives are on emerging eco-anxiety, term resource transfer, exhaustion, habits, roots into authoritarian control, which expresses energy dynamics, right time, capacity, commercial resource into new life, and cloud, practical, scrap, disability, climate justice, education, as a fashion, unrising, human, scope, translates, robust political imagination in defense of all life imagined as disposable. In our trans archives, we find unexpected climate workers, those who do not recognize themselves or not named by others, as sexual animals, more have energy, capacity, building within our spaces for environmental justice. The affective flows of fascist violence, organized worlding at the molar level, hierarchizing bodies, ontologizing gender and race as social differentiations of matters to enable mass violence. The fascist affective metabolism describes history onto bodies, rewriting the past and future, overwriting our ability to articulate its outside. But modernity does not have a monopoly on thinking. We cannot separate the warming of the world from suburbanization, white flight, the nuclear family, colonization, slavery, and its natural lives, eugenic protocols of abandonment, white supremacist immigration politics, and trans antagonism. Past the tipping point where existential threats to the white cis world dwell beneath the surface of the ocean, which has been rising since long before Time Magazine and Scientific American's announcements of crisis. Transversality articulates submerged forms of relationality. They cannot be visible to have effects. Spread together, these interactions teach us about risk, visibility, and regeneration. The urban and the ocean are connected. The impending collapses of the city is inseparable from the middle passage of mesh encroachment of black trans and black trans people threatens to overwhelm the hegemonic norms. We need to think about this together. We must think it all together as we engage in original, differential, materialist practice and study, understanding the fascist affective metabolism. The world is enshrined through crisis, gestures towards an urgent past, because we know that the state of emergency is also always a state of emergence. Theory makes this world the conversion of our lives and energy. We know that it is our task to bring about a real state of emergency, a rupture in history. Thus, Ray and I affirm an alternate energy politic of transversality. Transversality is a collective project, a collectivization of our desire, an attunement to a kind of intensity that cannot be quantified through the language of tipping points. Transversality tells us if at first we were approaching the project as two people, two bodies in space, two voices in the ether, our approach is now more like entangled particles of politics at the level of the molecular mode of analysis and praxis that dwells in the explicitly ungovernable excess between the spillage of identity and radical possibility. We learn from Coral how our kitchens might work differently from the site of the riot where a program or plan determines collective liberation. On the field of desire where transgalactic revolutions occur, new modes of social production become possible. Transversality is an explosion of communication, tracing the linkages between our transgalactic revolutions that are always already forming and becoming otherwise, because there is no other world, but it can't be this one. Wild 22. Transgalactic revolution, real science, realizing logic of law or institution, politics is no more powerful like desire, power to the body, second locality, politics is no longer quantification, almost counts to matter, claims to legal documents, prisons, transplanting defense, argue for trans inclusion, re-inscribes the systems, articulates law and order, society, justice, collective, source system, political upheaval, think inside the riot, path to your rights, which no longer produce trans phenomenon, liberations that follow, inclusion, political abolition, a call to fundamentally change life, curriculum, or trans aesthetics, transgalactic revolution, further makes it possible to black and trans life amidst political crisis, both petrifying state of things the economic history is remained through different repetitions, transgalactic revolutions unfold, we come to know the ways that trans works got together in our transgalactic revolution uses chart these new ways to make politics and life matter. Transversality calls us to ask a different set of questions by reading the subterranean convergence is not fixed, but extending in all directions, a collateral genealogy, and encountering the past also contains an ethical confrontation with the collateral damages involved in blackness as overseen and unknown. Brust 20. Though we struggles be formed at different levels, that one comes up man is white heterocapitalist bourgeois infrastructure is that which sustains the social remains imperturbable. Relations pulled together as we summarize against the systemic injustices towards liberation. We is always already, but cannot be productive in simple multiplicity. It is a process, an acknowledgement of mobility that occurs precisely because of violence, an invitation to recognize it, to act, means to have been acted upon, have been put in a place. We struggle together just as we struggle with we, resisting our positioning from the location of that position. We as liberty concept constantly coming, constantly failing, an invitation to burn the system of things through valleys to the ground. We is a glorious justice as a fantasy. We must be critical of the we, acting in the name of liberation remains opaque, a conflict, couples, negation, and affirmation, both of identity and of its fixation against the molar logic of tipping point that seeks to quantify the moment of crisis. Transversality is a turn towards a set of intimacies that may overturn the map of the world, some of the past self-active metabolism. Raha and Van 24. The responsibility that comes to sensitizing towards various ways of worlding requires a retuning of the intuitive. This rewiring, this conscious intuition emerges from one's connection to environments, connected to sociality. Even within hegemony, one can make material differences. Transit is not the rebellion, but a different hunger, a hunger for life perhaps not yet lived, which we are rehearsing in the underground. This strategy of principled, militant, intransigent opposition, gentle and personal relationships for comrades with whom one has become linked in struggle below ground. We do not abandon one another to the demands of the institution, and so colonial rewiring and learning linkages to the body-mind separation, undoing the unfeeling body norms, the ways of bodying through conscious transformation, a mode of relational solidarity that does not claim possession, questioning that language desire to possess, sensing can be open to different layers in the world, between worlds that is a way to make sense, transworld, selective process, and not a way, knowing this is a way of making worlds. Reflection follows the action learned from moving across worlds. We carry down this to different positions in history. We see a dominant emphasis to dominate the process of disconnect, undoing structural separation. It's not meaning we have to form a single collective in which everybody fits. A generous opening form, solitary health, possibilities of rewinding senses, retuning our intuitions into the frequencies of our complicities. Different flowers coming to bloom. I'm good for process.
Okay, you're good?
Yep.
Okay, if we win that decarbonization is bad, do we win?
I think that we have said that the question of this debate is one of an alternate energy politic of transversality that sustains our communities.
So, no.
I don't understand, like, that. I think you would have to beat transversality as a method. Is that right, Greg?
Yeah.
Okay, quote, to name where the crisis of our debates occurs that coheres the rhetorical assemblage of the community, what constitutes the debate community?
Well, some of the people here, certainly, the people here are one part of that community. Our argument is that that community is entangled.
Okay, the community is entangled, what does that mean?
For example, the way that Framework emerged as a response to critical apps, the way that trans and black debate push each other to think differently, like the debates that we've had against teams like NYU, who have kind of pushed us to think those entanglements, right? Those are examples of the way the community is entangled and is developed.
Everything's always entangled, got it.
It's entangled with the world too, right? We don't leave shit at the door when we come in.
For example, the way that
I think I've got everything
ceremony.
entangled.
Yeah.
Okay, collectivization of desire, what is desire?
Our argument is that our desire should be to the end of the world that makes these things possible. Out of that, practices might emerge. Things like de-arresting as a tactic is a way that we know our fates are entangled, right?
Sorry,
So we must,
what were de-arresting?
de-arresting is a tactic that transversality might kind of like produce.
Okay.
Another example is like the barn dance that Gray and I put on in Iowa City with Dr. Cram, something that connected issues of disability justice to climate justice to trans antagonism.
Why is that connected to voting after you read like a 9-minute 1AC and like spend a bunch of hours?
Well, because I guess transversality teaches us to think these things differently. That's our argument.
Okay, why should we say no to that?
Because, well, we think that negation could come in a number of forms. We think that it is that process of engagement, which are the examples of the debates that we've had kind of like early this year, debates against people like NYU. Who else have we had a really fantastic debate?
NYU, Wake, LS did a fantastic debate against where they questioned the sort of
Why?
That's the way she produced it. That was generative.
Why are you only naming teams that are competitively successful?
I don't even know necessarily, well, first of all, that is your mapping onto those teams as competitively successful, first of all, right?
Why is that true?
Because we didn't say who from NYU might be an example of this, but it also begs the question of what competitive success means. You have just overwritten all of NYU's debaters into into a team that I presume might
Also,
be bigger than man.
They're our fucking friends. Like, we don't determine our relationship to them through competitive success. We determine our relationship to them through the quality of debates we've had.
Yeah.
Okay.
Send
This quality?
to and then case. I don't know what I'm gonna use. Category. Excuse me. You said 2, right? Yes. Which leg is further?
I will be good in a second. Okay, I'm good.
And judges, all good. Awesome. Negative teams only can rejoin apps if the topical burden improves and valid by not using government. The USFG's 3 branches. That's 318. The Constitution provides the USFG federal government defending the 3 courts, Congress, executive, judiciary, and clean energy policies, law, Douglas 25 actions of clean energy and act 1 legally binding programs to legislation 3. The tax code, these needs to be statutory requirements and decarbonization for the reduction of GHGs from Nelly Franco 23. Decarbonization calculated for the cost of emitting CO2 emissions in common language used for further reducing all GHG emissions through various means in people realize that capitalism and imperialism have a problem with humanity. The question is how attacked and ideas are around sufficient is so knowledgeable skepticism embrace the massive emotional to back marks and self-criticism system like perverting ideas are great. Critics means a uniform what's the one which are the victory of the revolutionary sign what's in this possibility micro politics like the Afghan response to structural crisis endemic to capitalism staring and Williams 15 of Walter Hegel which is from capitalism in the federal world is a political conflict that will the actual mechanism of power technique strategy creates able to transform the cultural power of freedom during their practice our will not propose and tuition and EDC always better for culture and every active response that governments rather than initiating action and the strategic goals of the practice for practice that are often inherently doing fertilization for spontaneous of the institutional problems together and whether there's a purpose of everyday over structural personal experience of systemic thinking dealing with the particular universality universal politics project from the outside the problems of the structural local the problems of the political thinking right the concept and acting on private religious level and according to traditionally James 15 the older very much for competition simply show the differences in differences becomes a researcher clear what does really instrument for the dissonance noise investments in the land possible model for using political organizations solution everything local church and comfort politician on these videos modules and because according to this information almost the digital problems like generates order expenses people over cycle levels deploy mechanism with it flaming it more efficient ways to not resilient to political and economic damage metallizing to make sure it's sort of understanding and running the technology discourses to make more noise from generation of different diversity to bring around children more to reflect is that it's the political nature problem to the founding right of no and destructive and property feature and alternatives party building the left is organized and ready and prepared to confront the fascist capitalist state that when we resolve these contradictions and build a revolutionary situation in democratic socialist balanced party black like now 21 everything that we know the rest of the imperialism defeats the primary conditions elected mouse party and the US party to the concrete reforms party president PC who's one selection was the task of communism and develop Germans and leaders on operating form the Joseph revolutionary matter correct lines of militancy and government the people organized and everything else even people to take a determination leadership working with masses as well and the communist party raising them over artificially and unbelievable revolution and they are looking at a singular man revolution being further than the legal party going to the knowledge and everything to one person or over and fair for the privileges of the people who must have military holidays and data or organization work has been also played for government conditions as the people have been in the favor of one fact petition going to play based on the national revolutionary triumph case. Both negative on presumption, the act must solve the harm they present that they don't. One materially advocate for more communication is not unique in activity about talking. There's only a risk they expose politics to is negation to turn community we have to say or wrong, which creates a negotiation. Next debate is an impasse between what it seeks critiquing transformative world making, academic competition with capitalists, universities, personal social movements as evidence and detachment from alternative world making and neoliberalism must next expensive on holes of 23 versus where students in the funds with their institutional monopolies over their the illustrated being on the growing spending for the other season editorials rather than sitting in the original other institution can imagine we creating what do we were supposed to do out there which persists because of religion on our that creates a world making something it's sort of like something that reads our physical self-sustaining image imagine to correlate the radical features of those things a arousal and some of those particular capitalism to go on a emergence of sexual linear parallel and energy there's on it there's nothing revolutionary about the satiation of deciding to radical transformation or regret more much more happy life as they experience the section of capitalism lies and observe some on a critical process but much performance good and reification and record so that it's not always being new and the personal social on the side of the character with some setting of rolling your long and attached to capitalism for project for reproduce and pictures of workers on property and commerce scholars study capitalism and the university translates the vocabulary of each how capitalism not just produce a local contribute to the colonial racist system comes out as a person making a take of this and neoliberals and traffic organized field surveillance like not just by material hours and industry specialized in the capital administration or anything and or automation sense of diversity they translating it field it's an roses and is the polluted murder of a million and every resistance fails wrong because 9 every resistance everywhere association services so well power and everything greater benefits of the resistance and was material conditions violence and environment easily and charming resisting the alter and interior conditions are deadly any churches power just remain on until against celebration resistance available for power relations are crazy because in that equal classes and most of the one of respect and engagement power that acts add up to the broader needs of the resistance to the revolution mechanism power reverse globalized domination resistance continuous provoking your friends practicing in front of businesses that by installing all ending library tools and division in the idea maybe consider restraining corporated laws for missions or those who govern every resistance as a little understandable conscious just realize and accurate understanding of power and control but about GGA that's why it works recuperating the neoliberal university schemas by 18 and original models little incorporating diversity distinction between things realize over the areas and responsibility mindful of the need for universities rising social change interaction shortly toward transforming individual conscious student life and transforming change and do that with technical experience about some understanding contemporary noble thirdly university of leisure being and public resistance Aboriginal self-play versus organizational and political and confrontational items and the joining person under anything like which performance based on training of versus coding to be person and viable and similar specific change because the universal inclusion for all and that's majority of people in education skills is objectification of the grounds for social gratification. The anti-material polity is co-opted by effective markets that demand overcoming of damage and demonstrate our resiliency. James 15, individuals emotional and physically with therapy to neighborhoods that change one of us. Treat yourself to overcome damages of performing performance resiliency. Self-awareness is the key to returning to one's natural state of psychological levels. Naturalized damage is necessary to help get subject to trying to achieve balance and health by other because of benefits, raising the level and take a resource to be resilient, unique capital, and reform crisis with simple authority, seeking privilege, relating to areas of all those circles, all these, and areas of need along with customer therapy, self-awareness, and investment in human capital, resilience, is resource, and areas to be more efficiently.
Skip that card.
Mark the card efficiently.
That was resilient?
Yes.
Okay, then.
Declaring community as internal for formation reproduced despite Islamic for writing to the corrupt for being the claim of academic public culture and implemented bad practices and initially consistent with interest in non-performing rights and performance when it does declaration of interest is like an institution and actually describing services there when it's very privileged in ways that are unforeseen. But it's struggle society of academic critique, deep politicizing the short material change in favor of academic legitimation bills. 99 answers around the world of critics, special academia, equity, resistance to service and academic criticism, and knowledge of fails to provide any criminalization versus the putting these all to whether to put it and seeking exploitation, also when they fail to practice when our taking healthy from the streets and sitting in classroom training with topic analysis or reproduction, but in the political economy, areas of the weird to lead members are afraid be brought up with their service and their service and research all to the litigation and should decide for energy and academic practice destroy the critiques of academic take place in struggle material opportunities, academic education, creates material education, additional level of music, incorporating struggle and academic critiques, not for alternative, reading so excited and technical very incomprehensible runs are especially in the litigates and dominant power relations in the academy. So
I should probably get Clash. Good. Wait, no, I shouldn't say that.
we're good.
Alright. Okay, I want to start on topicality. You have read Douglas' piece of evidence that is in the context of Virginia's laws about clean energy policy. Why is that a predictable place to locate what clean energy policy means? Because I thought that USFG meant like the government, not like Virginia.
This
What?
is one, it's Vermont law school, so law, government, legal, but also it's about
Wait, law, government,
well,
legal is your term?
it's also about an executive order that was in place for
It's about an executive order in Virginia. Why is that a predictable place to locate?
Do you want to say?
We're not saying like Virginia is the apotheosis of
Oh,
legal definitions. We're
perfect.
saying that clean energy policy should be defined as law and it's good.
Okay, so it should, okay. You're
Everything-
arguing about argument or fine. You have this dogma impact. What impacts in the act do you think that dogma, that your like dogma standard could solve?
So,
Do you think it solves transcendentism?
our argument is that dogma is external. We think argument refinement
Dogma
turns
is-
other arguments.
Wait, Pat.
Real quick, should we be dogmatic about some things?
Like maybe,
Okay.
but we should come to that conclusion, with I guess
Okay.
clear amounts of information.
Yeah, we'll do it with carbon tax this time, don't worry. The critique. Why are so many trans people communists? We are. Like, that's true. But why? Like, Ali, you've read an Escalante piece about this. Why? What is it about transness and the experience of thinking these things at different levels that leads so many of us to the conclusion that we should?
That we should
Be
become
communist?
communist?
Yeah.
I don't really understand what that has to do with the UK.
Wait. Well, first of all, you've read the critique against our
But
you've read some trans
the
communists.
critique
so why
is
are
based
so
off the
many trans
method
people?
of the affirmative.
Okay, so the
Not based
method of
on-
transversality is
And also, I feel like individualizing like people within the community doesn't create a community, but individualization within this like
wait, what?
kinship that you're promoting in the affirmative. Like saying some people, like some trans people are communists, probably like takes out a lot of your offense because there's no,
No,
community
I'm asking
created
if
from
there's-
saying
if
that
there's,
some individuals are
that-
benefited from the act.
Well, hang on. No, because like for example, Gray and I are members of the YDSA. I mean, like there are. I guess like there was something. I'm asking
Like,
like,
I don't
what
under-
is that thing that draws us to these conclusions to think?
Well,
these
we're
things
saying the
together?
method of the affirmatives have failed to draw the conclusions that we're
Oh,
We
okay,
haven't
that's fine.
identified
That's
an
fine.
affective
That's
reason
fine.
that
The
people
black
are
like
coming.
mouth piece of evidence says, quote, obsolete socialist parties are propaganda speechifying about reforms. Why is speechifying about reforms bad?
Where?
It's a quote. Like I swear to God, it's a quote. I just read it.
Because revolutions aren't just a matter of that, but building ground up through that, like,
Revolutions are not just a matter of reforms, but they're about building from the ground up. Y'all should remember that.
Okay, 10 minutes, starting.
let's go around. Sorry.
Alright, 954. It's sent. Order is case, framework K. Anybody not have that?
Is there a question?
Yeah. Consent.
Okay, I'm good.
Panel. You. We affirm a practice of transversality and alternate energy politics to sustain communities within the collective assemblage where trans-molecular revolutions occur. As well as molecular enunciation, the black and trans life that always has the capability of mapping morally by the fashion affecting metabolism because there is no other world, but it can't be this one. This debate is a question of emergence versus emergency. Our series that cares about the world, energy politics, right from a structural feeling will cause the fascist affecting metabolism that is catalyzed through the tipping point. Transversality is a practice message to understand the ways this crisis is necessary to ensure the world. White flight, trans-tipping, when climate deployment, the core resources engaged in this process of transversal linkages to understand the ways this violence is constitutive. Impact that way. 1. Polarization. We're forced to see ourselves in polarized and molecular ways. We have to try and interpolate to be a proper figure of transits, which causes exhaustion. We can only ever respond to the kind of crisis in macro political ways whenever understand this constitutive violence. 2. Crisis logic. Form the organized abandonment, environmental destruction, fashion, wrong crisis necessary to ensure the world in an attempt to end that world which reproduces those antagonisms. On presumption. 1. Whatever the good idea, transversality departs through the ways of linkages built or desire towards the end of the world. 2. Roles of judges prioritize entanglement. Transversality should teach you to reevaluate your relationship with things like trans antagonism. 3. Examples of sovereignty. A. Horizontals collective development, which uses space as ballroom and art to provide self-defense and care for trans women of color. B. Dearest comrades like Spencer talked about it in cross-sex. C. The Philadelphia farm girls include black and trans women affiliated respond to organized amendment with sustainable food programs. And C. The examples of barn dance Spencer gave in cross-sex that we organized using transversal thought with Dr. Cram. And on presumption proper. 1. Example may prove materiality, it's arbitrary lying. 2. Negation doesn't turn community. KVK may prove this. We'll be off on some framework because I want to say every KVK debate we had just was stupid and made us more dogmatic. What? That's a violent rhetoric that eliminates the critical tradition. You choose not to engage. On Academy. 1. Raw internal tunes this evidence because it says we refuse to abandon each other to the Academy. That's how we would unlearn the procedures of the Academy to make debate a gender space. 2. This turns framework cards as capital full of desires. The framework is the example how they do this. 3. No link to end the world. Don't try to proliferate its futures. And on Gako's 1. Half the material that was the example debate. 2. We must attune to the molecular because organizing happens. We energize each other and resist on the molecular. On the critical pedagogy argument. 1. Raw evidence again links to resist because it's how we resist from within the Academy. 2. No utopianism argument, which is try or die now when the Academy is a dystopian place of trans antagonism. On J. 1. Proves our affect theory argument, but 2. Not resilience arguments because we're how we fight back and orient our desire towards the end of the world. Our argument is that different communities have a shared commitment to resilience and status quo now, but transversality is how we build linkages with that community to take resilience and mobilize it towards the end of the world. On Ahmed. 1. Rahan Bruce solves this evidence because it says that sort of only declaring whiteness is bad. Our argument is how we orient to move past just these simple declarations and learn to resist. Finally, with the Phillips evidence. 1. This on cards from CEDA credit. No reason uniquely applies to the affirmative applies to debate judges. 2. Not a reason to not vote affirmative. It's a good idea. 3. Reject big say. Deny transversal engagement. 3. Reason to reject the team. And on to framework. At the top, we control uniqueness. Debate is entangled with the world around it, intensifying white supremacy and fascism, the gunning of democratic institutions, and compounding such ecological crisis from the backdrop of debates delivered to stasis. 3 implications. 1. Framing. Your battle is not a question of procedural violation, but transversal obligation to protect black and trans life in face of intensified attack. There's an obligation to seize any space possible for celebratory practice. 2. Offense. There is a commitment to neutrality in the face of generational terror, the continuation of war by other means that allows this violence to continue and intensify, maximizing residual impacts of the demand to return to business as usual, so we risk to exclude critical knowledge. 3. Defense. Transversality disproves competition framing. Black and based on game, but emerges through a shared transversal commitment to survival and liberation in the face of crisis. That is, cooperative incentive checks on explosion ensure safety through by how candidates read the same apps against each other, even when we know the other team won't go for T. See Monster 24. Where the metaphor is cultivating creative capacity and community access, living curriculum spontaneously shaping jerky on the district itself and learning that rising response to changing environmental conditions, the whole rising becomes a GPA priority and provider synergy for students of power to create alternative connections with each other. Learning becomes an affective and embodied practice, sustainability rise from communities as foreign and experimental ethical politics, where it's like ethical politics. Reject convenience in terms of logic of emergency that frame critical data as antagonistic to plan debate justified elimination. And counter-interpretation that affirms to endorse a message for energy planning. Apps like long weeks to do OSB, whereas apps that refuse to talk about offense only about themselves and policy plans don't, because they don't undergird the core energy of the topic. Under a model next to message, theory, or performance, but all engagement is guides to a relationship of obligation that orients clash towards liberation, which proves ample ground and checks on fairness. Prefer arbitrary inclusions over arbitrary exclusions. A model that underwhelms the last a time bit more apps is one that is much better than one that overwhelms so much that it invisibilizes trends. And prefer countergroups, grounded in core topic controversy, reinserting one AC Cram 24. And there's a tipping point to this ad. Framework is performed in emergency K-based emergency plan debate, which so sees the fashion. Framework isn't a logical response, but affective one that instantiates an antagonistic rather than agonistic relationship to critical scholarship. The history of reaction to critical tradition brewed from 2013 were all right fashions that quote, Washington reinforced the merits of conventional debating and focused on reason rather than motive garbage. 2 decades later, the regular arguments made a tickle and can quote, actually saying that bullshit would propose the carbon tax and the wokeism-induced brain rot. The dipping point of the DA impact turns the capacity to name their limits as record one, students use inevitable appeal to the resolutions to try to prolong the late. It naturally relates this world into the elimination of black and trans political life. And inevitable call to suicide supercharges reasonability by continuing to recur the topic, can't solve our offense, remember the day after they just framework against us too. This will also take out their inevitable call to the TVA because arguments about abandonment and offense turn this. Cram says it's how our grievances get actualized against the world. And there's more violence to that. Cases the DA framework. Fail force and more viewpoint in politics that creates an affect investment in government as a solution to its own crisis, produces fatalistic liberalism that acquire Stockholm syndrome to the state. The impact is more violence, ecological devastation, anti-blackness, trans antagonism operate on a molecular level. Please come with any attempt to claim self-defense in the current frame of the dirty as they don't transform or establish entanglements. So innovate more violence leads to coaches and debate prioritizing substantive clash over ethical intervention into unethical rounds. Also, group objections come prior to giving the question of what we normalize in the community. And we meet 1. Decarbonization, U.S. elects and new colonialism. Article 20, decarbonization, U.S. applies the shift to the cost of energy. Article 2, crossed by the crime methods here, and interpretation of clean energy equally as arbitrary as there. And 3, market-based styles of politics. Around 22, market-based reproduction of the description of life as atomized private. And skipping wild, going on to get. First, there's the deep bourgeois double standard game. Double scoring crap and framework. The ability to kick out shows there's the deep bourgeois sells ultimately going against tough. The fact that framework is an example of how the COINTELPRO, that's false consciousness, that forces them to either go for both cross by between. If they go for campaigns, they don't solve because their framework, so they rat us out. Means only the purview of turns us out to solve because it teaches us to entangle flows and stay entangled and obligated to scholarship we proliferate and read. Top level said this debate is not a question of the best method to resolve capitalism. It's a question of the affective burden that enter their politics that always predetermine what actions occur. Capitalism realism is structured in this way. People choose to invest back in a system they may not like because their affect were trying to do so. We control uniqueness. Fascinating this pervasive now, they all can't scale fast enough to solve, which means try to affect because we have an analytic resolve inclination towards fashion. Organizations like the American Communist Party, ACP, approved socialist organizations not immune from fashion metabolism, which is inoculation that benefits the perm. Perm to both means former organizations are better web relations, organizational forms of trying to engage in networks and something nobody can opt out of. Hierarchical organizations of themselves, native networks, and serious organizations, produce above morality, can be ecological, pursuing action, different forms, establishing transversal links. Mark that card as transversal links. That takes out most of the link arguments, but one, the Escalate flows out Marxist center class because they didn't have transversal links between the parties that allowed for the base to become too big. Transversality solved this by orienting desire in one direction. Next, Erica Williams link is a win that were folk politics as a net benefit of the inclusion of the Af and the Perm. Their alternatives exclusive, which leads them to failure. American Williams 15. Folk politics is not in the explicit position, only an implicit tendency. The problem is not that. And it starts from local. All politics begin from local. The point is to project folk politics. Folk politics is a necessary component of a successful political project. Folk political things can go and be adapted to other political projects. The idea that one organization sector sharing price equally what I ensure the one is most pervasive and damaging beliefs among today's left. Therefore, today's that folk politics is necessary is a post-capitalist political project. On the James arguments, one, they can't remain a resilient swings. They produce the same discourse of resiliency at the level of form and content. James predicts how, quote, neoliberalism reimagined market systems of free competition, which means one, as a level of content, their performance in the landscape, clean energy policies, and affirmation of the topic of fundamental issues in the market makes them way harder. Two, at the level of form, they would seem to manage the free logic of competition and their arguments about dogmas. And finally, can be linked with their own theory of power, because the change that capitalism as this, as well as semiotic, because our argument about the explosion of communication. On the one, localism, never entangling good and the app, or one for himself. One and see black white math. 21. One another education for good friends of communists. Fuse to make true friends with some that every time communists meet other true communist message study revolution, be prepared, establish that others listen to arguments meet them, share criticisms. But their interpretation of topicalities and TA is their ability to solve their performance in debate and perform the same resilience wing. One and see black white math. 21. Also, socialist parties on propaganda speech find about reform. And there's a revolutionary affect here. So it's solely an affective process. There's no revolutionary product. They can't staticize how much praxis fragment we need to build the party, but the conversation we have here orient desire. This means revolutionary organizing mystifies the molecular return we do for one another, which de-energizes the collective assembly by mastering every space towards the revolution. It's joined or dialogic, which is fascist. Where parties like the ISO class, after it comes out, they hit us with sexual assault allegations because they weren't useful towards party organizing. They have correction tendencies toward whatever accountability mechanisms they say. Socialism and barbarism. Choice of words.
Yep.
Yeah.
Transversal commitments to survival under the inter who has this commitment to survival.
Oh, we all do. We say the critical tradition is exemplary of how we build that transversal commitment
So,
and how it operates in debate.
Sure. KVK debate survive, correct?
I think it's not only a question of survival, but it's also a question of ending the world that kind of makes.
This is true. Survival and liberation. We do not stop or should not stop at survival.
So what?
We should
So how do you
build
continue
in
for
this
this
world.
liberation? How does that happen?
How do we continue for this?
Yeah, like how does liberation happen or end of the world happen?
What do you mean?
End of the world. We do not stop at survival. How do we get from survival to the end of the
We need
world?
to explain in a lot of ways transisality is able to do. The first, with how it orients society. Our argument is it teaches us an entanglement and obligation to one another that directs.
Sure.
our
Entanglement.
Because
How do you
we have
account-
theory of politics that starts with a little attack on that structure of feeling
Okay.
and emotion that undergirds the political and discursive reality.
So
that
how does
provide
it-
energy for politics?
So how does that energy transform to the end of the world? Like what steps are taken?
I think
Step-by-step approach.
I think
step
this
one.
kind of 1, 2, 3 framework is kind of problematic and missing the point. Our argument is that transisality isn't a movement. It is movement. It's what teaches us to end this world. Our argument is that examples like the barn dance Spencer and I did prove how we can actualize.
Entanglement. So that's like the connection of like different methods that come together to create a
Also,
community.
it's
Yes.
an understanding of how we cannot think things like anti-blackness, trans antagonism, ecological crisis, etc. apart from one another because they're fundamentally entangled.
Okay.
like
So
Trump
if they're
saying that-
fundamentally entangled, how does one like method or theory account for another in a world where like
What do you mean?
entanglement happens? How is each like individual method accounted for?
What do you mean?
Wait,
What do you mean?
Like barn dance example, how is this accounted for like KVK debates outside of like two separate things? How are
So-
these like how does this entanglement
Yeah,
happen?
1AC Wild 22 is really good on this. Wild describes how we often try to think of things like Compton Cafeteria or Stonewall as separate events happening on the other side of the nation. But that is false because they are fundamentally entangled. They are ripples of the same effect of the movement towards transversality. We need to understand them as such. When we understand these as disparate, it silos our politics. We stop being able to think
So,
about
And
it.
we start to think of like what is the 1, 2, 3 of liberation?
Okay.
And you just did in Carson.
Sure.
That is our polarization.
So if this is like a movement that's happening outside and inside of the debate, what is the necessity for the inside of the debate part and movement to the necessity outside?
There is no inside to outside of debate. Trans antagonism runs through this space. Spencer getting dead named at cross-sex. The shit that happened in the halls.
Sorry,
People
that
slamming
was the
the
award
hall-
ceremony.
Yeah.
She said the wrong word. It was the award ceremony, not process.
My bad.
Yeah.
All the shit that happens with like Texas threatening to call the cops if you
Yeah.
exercise your radical freedom or whatever, right? There's no
So are
inside
we?
and outside.
So like this kinship community that is promoted through the affirmative accounts for all of these instances of like violence or trans antagonism.
Well,
What do
sure.
you mean?
Well, yeah. What do you think counts for? Because
Like-
our argument is that accounting is the tipping points logic that we've said is bad. It's not about accounting. It's not about movements. It's about movement itself.
That's on the case.
Okay.
T. Wait, no, KT.
KT. Is there a back?
No. Are we good?
Quick clue on T. I have placed 10 cells before the first piece for a minute.
Maybe I'll put 5 in one. Okay. Are we all good? Concede the permutations and testing competition solves all of their offense. The American communists are bad and fascist. Proves links to you as well. Proves it's impossible to create a genuine form of community debate. Transversality doesn't erase any fascists that exist in any community, which means that there would equally be those in the transversal form of politics that they create, so they're not able to solve any of their offense. So it's not unique. Now, anything else was not a DA and it was not applied to T, and the state reform fails thing will not matter because that would only be a negative argument under our interpretation. Topicality. Voting for clean energy policy debates as games structured by a shared desire to win Team Street cards, do line by line to search each other, drop arguments, all with the intention of procuring a ballot. But from this side, grounded the resolution stack the deck against the next, since they can determine the value system of debate and deny negative engagement. Two implications of that: one, competition overdetermines radicalism. It's presumption every argument in the 1EC and every argument in the 2AR will be chosen not because it's right, but because it's the most winning. The implication of entering the app in a competitive format while you render a judgment is that I will have crafted their advocacy in a way that's most palatable to beat T. And per case, it proves proven by going for arguments that would explicitly disagree with 1EC premises. Assigning the argument of truth is bad faith, since it's impossible to force it from its utilization for the ballot. If that's not true, vote negative assumption. Since it doesn't require the ballot to return the case, debates competitive format denies any intrinsic value for reading the 1EC because the neg's response must be refutation, not acquiescence. The requirements to say no either creates an unproductive argument of extremism or might self-achieve that setback from debates. There's no incentive or ability to make the most directly clashing arguments, since those are the ones the app's best position to answer. Now, fairness is a meta impact that outweighs. One is rejoinder debates requirement of saying no means that the role of equitable engagement must come first, otherwise there's no value in entering the 1EC into the activity at all. True competition. Voluntarily entering a competitive tournament, describing speech times, filling out press, sharing evidence, stacking coaching debates proves that winning is just as important to Iowa as it is to Kansas. Otherwise they would have conceded. So we have the most engaging discussion about transversality, equalizing fairness. It's key to preserve competition because teams have no incentive to participate in the activity if their effort is ultimately meaningless. 3, paradox criticisms of fairness negate themselves because they're delivered in a technical format with an expectation you'll allow them. We don't have to win. Fairness is good, but defense or patrons are contradictory and can be endorsed. 4, ballot key. The ballot solves fairness by saying forcing us to negate an unstoppable athole, knowing it is unfair. It's ultimately unfair. It does not change anything about the broader structure. They've criticized the debate community. Anything else is cruel optimism because you guys their structural impact to be rectified within an individual action. That they didn't extend terminal impact to defense to fairness, and they dropped that T as a procedural question that makes the question of the neg's ability to engage. Now extend our interpretation. Neg teams only need to rejoin absolutely in top of written proof that requires governmental action proved by our definitions of UFSG as 3 branches adopting clean energy policies requires the force of law. NBIs use price signals to discourage greenhouse gas emissions. They would meet that interpretation. This solves their offense. 1, read and lose. They said that the 1EC's performance was sufficient to engage in transversality. Proves there's no reason for us to negate. 2, it includes our arguments as neg ground. Okay, the first theory of power argument about how debate is all entangled and that topicality is bad. 1, T does not homogenize this debate. It does not render a judgment on what is and will be topical forever. It says that in this debate, the negative advocate a more defensible model. We shouldn't assume productive debate is going to happen in this flow, or that every model of debate has the same quality of testing. Striving for a model of engagement that allows rigorous testing is not removing your transversal obligation. It's an engagement, or if it is, putting aptitude because it affirms their form of transversality as the apotheosis of black and trans engagement for the future. 2, don't just refuse topicality for the possibility of a different form of debate. Total refusal of topicality creates worse debates. A, generative K debates are constrained by resolutional limits constructed by precise definitions. Their functional limits, like KVK debates, are only possible through people engaging in the cis debate and saying that state-based climate policy is worth discussing more than other realities. If it is impossible to win engagement that creates new ones, it's infinitely foreclosed by accepting the inevitably large plurality of absent topical limits, which starts the DA. Taking the teeth out of topicality encourages a rush to truism, which makes it impossible to debate. B, the whole point of 3, that there's no internally, they cannot connect this instance of using topicality to other forms of forms of creating socially ecological institutions and white supremacy. Importantly, because we are in a low-stakes game where the only endpoint is linear loss, whereas their examples have deeply material results, it's bad to assign a higher meaning to the ballot because setting the precedent that any judge has imposed against a transversal obligation is more likely to cause their external impacts because it places far too much power in ideological judges' hands, which is violent. They say this is offense because it creates procedural, as usual, that argument was answered about. They say transversal obligation outweighs fairness. It doesn't because it comes before since it's a procedural question. And they haven't explained why their transversal obligation is true. They say defense, this is wrong, it doesn't solve limits exclusion. K-debaters might read the same apps against each other, but that was answered by our argument that it makes it impossible. Those K-debates are currently constrained by the resolution. They say competing interpretations is a logical elimination. It's not. Models of debate are good. One, our internal links, this debate only leads to an unlimited free-for-all. App teams can say this with whatever app they want, so you never have power to impose a model, and neg teams have no recourse because they can't go for T. And there's no DA because the apps only have to defend the in-round effects of inclusion or exclusion to ethical localism. We should care about debates holistically under each interpretation. They determine what holistic ability for fairness, depth of debate engagement with our opponents about scenarios that we might not immediately be able to effectively accounting for what's in here. Teachers has to be passive subjects who don't advocate for material change. If they don't win no models, they can't solve their offense because every other debate would thump violent debates, and we have an in-round ballot impact. There's also no link because it does not say black and trans debate or an emergency. It says that you not solve your offense, and we should not have to rejoin you. 2, it requires them to win. All of their other debate DAs win. And 3, they don't solve competing interests bad. They included a counter-interpretation, and they've also equally prescribed what people should do. They say their counter-interpretation is energy planning. They don't need it. The app is not a form of energy planning. It says transversality. No reason why those are connected. If it is that proves limits exclusion, they link to their offense. If their interp has any limits at all, it proves that they link to any exclusion. DAs and other apps can use their clever hedge apps can use the topic as an example of energy planning. 3 DAs, their interp one predictable limits. It's not a functional constraint. It allows apps with a tangential relation to the topic. Critical purpose sections like Baudrillard, Deleuze, Hod, the case of climate change, media analysis of jobs, each with if it's all the 2 mechanisms, limits 1 to the case shall case next increase the likelihood of knee-jerk onesies, which reduce rhetorical balance, choose arbitrariness. The rest was announced and voted on whether interp was decided in the 2AC. There's no distinction between their interp justifying the rest entirely since they can post hoc no change when it means to be a burden of proof. It's also not stable since it justifies changing their interp in every debate. 3, ground debate requires saying no, which is why we vote for controversies, forcing you to have to defend government responses to climate change, treats multi-pronged tests of advocacy, like oil and econ case, like the AFCAP, individualism, etc. Post hoc interps make ground a function of how kind the 2A is and creates a strategic or rush to truism. They say ground checks on fairness. It doesn't. I explained why our interp was key to their ground above, and they did not explain any example of what ground we get under their interpretation. They say arbitrary inclusion is better than arbitrary exclusion. This is wrong. It makes it impossible to be neg. Some over-limiting. Some limits are good because neg teams should be able to respond to their opponents, and they're not just arbitrary inclusion. They explode the lid off the topic. They say they counter-interpret as a topic controversy. It is not because it's not used to topic words. They didn't redefine any of them. They say tipping points DA. 1, framework is not unification of tipping points that threaten debate. Our argument about fairness is not that everyone quits or that the debate as an activity just stops existing, but that because debate does exist, it should occur in a manner that guarantees competitive equity. This is all of our arguments on the overview. Every technical investment Iowa has made demonstrates today are relied on as well. 2, if debate is always already entangled, that means teams going for T is necessary for Iowa's argument of improvement. Arbitrarily excluding topicality demonstrates how Iowa is willing to sacrifice the ideas that they think don't fit into their vision of transversality, which will be along the lines of competitive success. That also means that we had other KVK debates that are good. It's not offensive debate, that's true, but despite and because there are teams willing to go for topicality. 3, this is motivating, using it as at its finest. They flipped aft knowing that we've only gone for topicality against critical affirmatives. And 4, we don't concede to an antagonistic response about climate change. We have a debate about that, and that's good. They've not explained what the internal link to any of this offense is, and switch side debate certainly solves it. We do not deny the critical tradition, and their offense is against individual people and debate comments, not the imposition of framework. Those people also think that spreading it is bad, and yet we do it anyways. They say terms capacity. It does not naturalize fascism. This was explained above. It is solely an argument about when the app is meant to burden of proof. Switch side debate does solve their offense because they can read their K and have debates if they need to say that every round is stuff like KVK is an app that links terms it. Sure, we would question whether some arguments rejoin the plan, but an argument that says market-based instruments are bad would certainly be unto our offense. They say the molecular violence, EA1, we don't create moral violence against transness. A lot of this was explained above because promise this is not, we do allow substantive engagement, but we do allow substantive engagement, and that's good, which was explained above, and their interpretation cannot solve it because they equally create the same sort of moral violence with their imposition of a counterterm or imposition against topicality. So they're not able to solve any of this. The last arguments that are like we meet, none of these are actually we meet arguments. Decarbonization is bad, it's a negative argument. Same with market-based instruments are bad, also a negative argument. And they don't meet any of these interpretations because the plan is not like we decarbonize by destroying the global south with neocolonial logic. So obviously this is not a counter-interpretation. They don't need it.
Ready?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the first thing I want to ask about, you use this term cis debate in speech, or say trans debate requires cis debate. I didn't say cis debate in my 2AC. What does this term mean?
I was more so saying that topicality as an imposition was valuable.
No, I get the
for
argument.
black and
I
trans
use the
debate.
term though, cis debate, that I think is interesting. What does that term mean?
I think the app has included references to things like black and trans debate. We would assume that the opposite of that is cis debate.
Yeah, I think that'd be great. My next question,
But opposites,
You're talking
everything's always
about
a
sort
single
of
reading framework.
the benefits of engagement, you're talking about the switch side. What is the value of the transversality K versus carbon tax F, and what is your 2AC to this K?
What is the 2AC to this case?
Yeah,
Well,
actually start with that one. What's the 2AC to the transversality K?
it would likely say that a carbon tax is a good idea and that micropolitical responses to climate change are bad.
Okay. How would you evaluate that debate? There's a very much and often epistemological affirmative question of what we do with our time here. How would we weigh that sort of debate against each other? You've said a carbon tax is good, we've said
Well,
epistemological things are bad.
how would I evaluate the debate? I would look at my Excel spreadsheet and then see whether the arguments line up. Like, you inevitably, like the same way you evaluate any other debate. I don't know why it's
I
different.
think that there's a lot of tension in some of these arguments you're making elsewhere, by the way. This was kind of like at the top, where the first thing you're like is, refuse the idea that basically you're making arguments like T checks KVK debates, which imply a question of models. And then elsewhere on the flow, you're like, no models, don't evaluate the worst of ours.
We did not say no models.
Okay, so the judge should evaluate this debate through a question of models and not like the fairness paradox / balance about cells as fairness.
We think fairness is both good if no models and models.
What? Okay,
So like fairness paradox matters even if models.
why?
What do you mean?
Why does we care about fairness too matter?
Because fairness is the value that implicitly underrides every piece
Wait,
of
how do you
evidence.
know?
How do you know it? Because if every judge made a decision that was like, I was lollygagging.
No, I'm
college
talking
judge,
about like how
Like-
well, first of all, yeah, we do expect trans antagonism to a certain extent, especially like when we're being judged by cis people. So, but two, more importantly, how do you know every action we take in this debate was motivated by like this kind of upholding fairness?
Like we don't know that every action is motivated,
Okay.
but we know that all
Which-
that goes through
that makes
fairness, which
sense.
proves it is an
It seems like
underlying
a
value.
scripting disadvantage your model. But that's fine, that's all the time I got.
There's no doc book in this case.
Well, you got that.
Alright.
Important space, you said?
I did. Yes.
No doc.
No doc.
I'm going with it.
Good. Perfect. A practice of transversality can never spill up, and these revolutions will always sacrifice some for a form of collective organization of whiteness, emergency versus emergence rigs, the question of emergency poor, who is not the first reactionary attempt at what goes in this debate space. And you should frame a lot of their offense. You should frame this debate with the fact that there's no shared commitment to materiality, the entanglement of transversality. There's no
examples in the comments of like the kind of debates. You had a couple of examples, and I mixed them up between like, it's not like just like before the ground stuff maybe.
I'm sorry. I really don't know what you're talking about.
Fair enough.
Like
Like what debates did you say? Like what kind of asking people were you?
I don't think. Oh, we said like you're interpolating to your offense.
No, like what kind of asking people were you under our model? What kind of examples of that?
We said it allows us to ask with tangential relations to the topic, critical perspectives like those we are to lose,
Oh, yeah.
climate change, media analyses, each of their defense.
I'm gonna log out of it.
Wait, can I still want an F instead of you? Yeah.
Anyone not ready? Oh, I'm sorry. It's case then. It's case then for Mark. No. New cards in the one I arguments today. Big time. Okay.
No Saudi collapse.
There's a crisis in search of the world taking place from a state of emergency lost by some price. Our theory, the facts and mechanisms and metabolism is offense on framework, and furthermore that they have conceded that 2AC link turn on James that says that things operate at the affective level and not the material level, which takes out all of the arguments on case. Our first is crisis logic, emergent black and translated as positive as emergency. It's when they invoke debates and to go here. The image of planned debate that never existed on its own terms here valid should refuse to name Kate after this planned debate's emergency, but instead the emergence of something beautiful and new. Second, polarization, their model retains our dogmatic commitment to institutional politics, but ignores the vibrations and shifts that happen below the surface and manifest new worldly kind of things that cannot be quantified through the language of fairness. That's the theory of change in politics that beats their arguments about fairness, that impact the content of their model, which neither political agency produces dysphoria. Now, the top level of the case, the top level of the case page and framing for everything they said here, everything is in extreme tension with their interpretation. They're talking about how anti-black debate is, and then they're like, well, actually, we should just read the framework, but only we have a way to solve that, whereas their interpretation denies it. Now, the first argument is that there's no shared commitment. Wrong. The affirmative link turns this because our argument is that we have to think these things together, which they're examples of things like God's person being cracked down, which are all discussed in what I see in Cram, and they've conceded every example of the way that we solve the way that we solve will be done later. The second argument is application by consumerism. First, wrong. Trump being able to say things like they're doing transgender operations on illegal aliens is not shaped through a desire to consumerism, but is nevertheless affectively charged. And two, they're too late for this because they have considered the James evidence. Third, with the third and fourth arguments about new realities are wrong because they're answering our other app, and Jackie probably knows this. The ballot framing, the ballot framing, our model is key to solve this desire argument about the desire argument about white people being abandoning the front lines. But we are the ones selected example answers this because they put white people in the front lines and in interactions with cops to protect trans people of color, which is essentially their model. Their argument on white flight wrong. Only we can solve. We've not drawn an analogy, but tracing the thread of the logics of emergency across different levels is key to transversality. The argument of this framework is anti-black, but not trans-antagonistic. First, this is polarizing because it assumes that anti-blackness is not trans-antagonism, which is wrong. It operates along gendered inflection points that prescribe particular ideas of white masculinity and femininity that are desirable genes, and all anti-blackness is trans-antagonism, and vice versa, which is I only we can solve, whereas they have polarized. We are not individuation. Your model is the group, the competitive, the competition is at this is a to them, but our interpretation is also that not one debate is a game, just that should be the role of the judges. The role of the judges to say obligated. See it as part of radical legacy. There's always a take with the violence that pervaded papers, the example of me being detonated the award ceremony, but it's also the site in which we articulate an alternative to the dominant modes of debate together, collectively think them together. The facts effect of towels that run through space, but don't perfect it by voting for a framework. Your obligations are transversal and extend beyond this round to something more matters. They conceded that questions of procedure should be thrown out. In that context, now the extractive labor arguments first cross by Rod and Russ obligation framework controls your understanding of this argument. They described and distracted status quo, which happens because they don't recognize our obligation. This is why debaters can reject their identities. Black radical liberation read arguments like bigoted anti-black histories is able simultaneously talking about the extractiveness of anti-blackness and not recognize that fucking tension, but the one you see solves because it understands the entanglements we have with one another as process oriented towards the collective, the framework. They've conceded CEDA evidence which frames your understanding of this debate. Debates entangled with the world and inclined towards fascism. The way all of you are reiterating your programs, your trans debaters, fans, and affirming cancer, scrutiny, trans educator, or reason why you should prioritize a model debate that gives trans people the skills to drive their model cancer, try right after. You should be willing to risk a minor loss in fairness for exponentially more relevant education in this political moment. Also, turn on defense and safety and predictability because those entangled crises are urgent and they don't stop me and start on tab room. Only we can attend to those discussions full of clash and gender represent strategies. Also, we've been asked with tangential relationship to the topic of random voter hardship will not happen because we must engage substantially over the topic CEDA evidence is current criminal defense. You did not hear them say this in the blog, and you should not let them say it again in the 2NR because it is an anarchist theory of voluntary association that checks every single one of the arguments on the flow. First, cooperation overturns competition. We have not one debate is purely a game, just that it should be, which is why they can't censor across us and why we don't expect fair decisions, why they cannot articulate why everything we've done is what about fairness. Second, functional limits are inevitable because of that. Third is rise about learning because it's a claim about the link grounds that we access to better forms of clash allows experimentation with tactics, whereas there's a predetermined process counterplans and econ is that which maintains fairness and produces more relevant clash. There's no personal attacks or violence happen in that debate. That's not evocative of obligation. If you can't think of anything that negates this app other than transititism good, that's a you problem. It proves the fair past effect and habits pervades debate. Now the fairness paradox bad frame is the past effect and habits because it frames values rhyming the harmful transit and trans rhetorics and you should vote effort to reject the transititis and procedure from transititis. The outcome of us losing on framework cross-sex inter-competition offer determines the ballot pick they drop, they don't get one on case, they deny connection, they say competition crosses value and the that was above the fairness paradox. All answered cool optimism wrong. We turn this because they can't actualize their model. So theirs is more cool optimism that it said that we refuse topicality and that causes worse debates. Wrong. That was our examples about how people still read apps against each other even when there is not going to be topicality. Our argument is not that now they say K debaters we read apps against each other. They conceded the example of how judges give feedback to teams even when it means that their own teams will lose on that. They're cranking them on the question of models that rhetorical violence proves that their interpretation causes more violence. I will extend the polarization just had here this impact on fair model, clash on fair, the grounds of upon which it produces fairness, and disavow the separability of energy policy, transititis, and anti-clash, which is why they can polarize to change their arguments like only the ballot solves it turns their education because the only solution they produce will shall like the fashion affect metabolism, weaponize your skills against magic press political order, makes it easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of fascism. Transititism does not mean you should maximize clash, you should extend the counter-interpretation after to find a method for energy planning, the rejoinder, accountability, and obligation. I did that above, so I can't. We meet our counter-interpretation because of cram, they drop the insert so I can't solve it. Intensifies dogmatism because it's double speak. They still have to be knowledge that race and gender are to go to every discussion of energy, but it's about the implications. Also can't solve any of our discussions which are to their invocation of framework and answer. The 10 points analysis stuff on case.
Okay, 7:45. Actually,
Yeah.
cap T case. I get this stand. Okay. We're good. Yeah.
Alright, let me respond to this.
Good.
Yeah. We're good. They dropped the case term that I was taking out of the capitalism K. I could see that there would be micro-fascists within alternative movements because there are people who are still understood as good communists who have bad politics that reify anti-blackness and trans-antagonism. The app doesn't give you a politics for how to deal with people who are supposedly on your side of resisting micro-fascistic desires and polarization, but does require an embrace of multiplicity which sneaks antagonism into their arguments. This is an independent ballot that turns the case. They have conceded only weeks to them, or at least it proves that their model of debate of rejecting the imposition of topicality cannot resolve any of their offensive transversal modes of engagement, will never provide anything more than just create more little kings who are ready to engage in the antagonism. They did not go to this page, they did not get new answers. There was a reason I spent 30 seconds on it. Framework. Vote negative for topicality. 1C definitions established a governmental requirement to use the price signal to decarbonize. They violate those requirements. Debate's primary motivation is a shared desire to win. It's innately adversarial, so any internalization for a higher value must start from the assumption of the possibility of disagreement. There are three framing issues. One, competition over determinants radicalism. The app chose the 1AC because they thought it would be win, not because they thought it was the most right. There's a reason they read this app against us in front of you instead of anything else in their Dropbox and maximize their chance of beating T. Any 2ARDA must be framed through this uniqueness question. You can't divorce their K of topicality from the assumption that critiquing topicality is itself strategic. If they don't care about utilization for the ballot at all, just vote next since there's no reason as precondition for their offense. 2, terms case, drop, forced negation, adversarial formats negate the value of introduction because the requirements to say no, liberatory potential for the affirmative doesn't matter at all because the next response will be the one that gets the most mileage for the win, that encourages minuscule disagreements instead of genuine testing to solve their offense. 3, balance all the T. 2 components of this: A, read it and lose, flag and drop, and extending their interp. If their offense is solely to the introduction of transversality or interpretation solves, because it suggests when neg teams are required to be burdened with rejoinder, they can say any app they want. Whenever our interp negs don't have to respond until the app needs burden of proof. B, fairness only. The direct effect of an unfair advantage of topicality is decreasing the likelihood of victory. Voting neg corrects that unfair outcome, not the antagonism itself. There's no corollary for their DAs because they're tied to extrinsic structures. Fairness outweighs their offense by wavering. They'll use words that sound like bigger impacts, but the competitive formation of debate is prior to that mattering at all. 1, rejoinder introduction in competitive format where the neg is required to say no means fairness comes prior because the only way the game works is if we're able to respond in the first place. All of our internal links prove their model of competition is unsustainable for negation since they don't have a pretty full basis for argumentation. They didn't answer this subpoint explicitly. If engagement is bad, then vote neg because that would also presumptively dismiss the necessity of them reading the 1AC true competition. Both teams have voluntarily entered a competitive format that describes it to competitive debate norms like sharing evidence, spreading cards, winning cookies, and not getting which debate. Iowa cares just as much as winning as we do. This outframes debate's utilization for their impacts, even if those are right. Fairness is prior questions is the value on voting on whether frameworks and antagonism requires that you evaluate the arguments for why framework is trans-antagonistic, which demonstrates their investment in fairness. Framework turns the role of the judge that requires you to stay entangled. If we win our arguments about competition, that is because framework is entangled. We should care about questions like fairness because they're necessary for the debate community. You shouldn't vote on something matters more than procedural because it requires Iowa win a much larger impact toward the framework than they did because the 1AR was largely defensive. Okay, the first argument of the 1AR, we did not concede their evidence. We spent a bunch of time talking about how the entanglement of the debate community was necessary to impose our offense as well through our interpretation. If debate is entangled with the world, that means not only that trans debaters and black debaters learn how to debate with each other, but also that Iowa has forgotten their indebtedness to framework debates which improve their skills. Debates can be entangled with the world, but that is no reason to vote out. Voting neg doesn't say debate has no relationship to anything outside it. It says that negating the app, that doesn't mean a topical burden of proof is unfair. We don't, they do not solve trans skills, which was most of the arguments on the capitalism K page. And we've said that they are key to skills, which is how they say minor loss on unfairness. They don't have terminal defensive predictability. They've dropped multiple impacts on the counterinterpretation. And it's not a minor loss, given that we have a massive internal links. They say they don't create ridiculous apps. This is wrong. The app is not the core of the topic. It engages in energy planning, but you don't know what that means at all. They say cooperation over determines competition. This is wrong. Why did they flip app when we said new? Obviously, there's some desire for them to win that goes beyond merely cooperation. They say functional limits are inevitable. This is wrong. They've dropped that our interpretation is key to functional limits because only the threat of the imposition of topicality requires teams not to defend truisms. They say because process and econ maintains relevant clash, we're not going for clash, so this doesn't matter. They say it's not we can only say trans attack isn't good. That's not our argument, and we won't give up. They say Paradox frames the ballot as trans attackism. This is wrong. We do solve our offense because voting negative says that the app is unfair. They say we cannot actualize our model, even if we cannot impose our model. It's still good to evaluate with competing interpretations. They dropped the ethical localism DA that says it's good to imagine things outside of ourselves, and dropped that this is unfair. They say we refuse topicality. It doesn't create worse debates. It does, which is the implication of our offense. They say judges give feedback. That doesn't change the impetus of treating decisions made by debaters. You may want us to be educated, but when we are debating, we are ready to win. Moralization DA, fairness outweighs it because it's the only thing the ballot can solve. We've not extended the skills impacting factor and said that the structure of debate denies it. The counterinterpretation, it links their offense. They drop the arbitrariness internal links. They drop that violent asking their counterinterpretation, so they can't solve their offense. Their interpretation is arbitrary because it's not based on resolutional words, which makes it impossible for the negative to engage, which is the full extension of the argument above. They say switch side doesn't solve their DAs. It does solve their DAs because it's not just about the invocation of framework, but if things like market-based discussions and common policies are bad, it links. Okay, the case. No winter because affect fails drop because it's under the guise of consumers, so we can never be actualized by people waiting on the front lines doing agriculture offense because they drop that will always be too much. And that leads to dangerous communities for trans people of color, which create an unsafe new world established by the very left community that the affirmative tries to preserve Iowa's extraction community allows them to be safe by making others in danger. Think of this in the context of when we see words like entanglement that presumes that we just need to connect without understanding the terrain in which we connect the world to judge. Is to vote for the team who did the better debate, which is CEDA, our fairness offense, which we explained on the other page. We'll go for individuation. It takes out their framework offense. Asserting that entanglement happens in a way that there are shared values does not necessarily have that practice debate, not a double term with framework, you said radical communication. We said that radical communication fails its offense because voting egg solves because it rejects their model of communication.
Cool. Before you leave your Anyone not ready? You're voting affirmative to this debate because the negative has refused to deal with a terminal double term we had on the case debate. That the enormity of the precariety facing the world now is transit, anti-blackness, ecological destruction, colonialism means debate has to match the stakes of the situation we face. We cannot give them an inside-outside debate because we're going to win that transitionality is the only method to resolve our understanding and orient our desires into debate space because there is no other world, but it can't be this one. On case, vote after endorsing practice of transitionality, massacring linkages in the collective assembly to orient our desire towards the end of this world, not its reproduction. Zero, anyone in the debate has ceased the fashion affect metabolism be properly answered. You know the 2R didn't have a word on it. We're winning that crisis necessary to sustain the world and sustained by a pre-conscious structure we call the fashion affect metabolism. They can't go for consumerism outweighs this because one, they didn't have a war in the 2R. Second, they continued the James argument that no, consumerism in the material can't overturn the affect comes prior. Now, the impact I'm going for is the moralization impact transfers become forced to see ourselves in more and molecular ways on our crisis love, anti-blackness trends attacking the ecology are separated from one another, which never allows us to realize that our fates are entangled and orient our desire towards the reproduction of a world that is not replicating this form of violence. This means you also cannot understand there to be an inside or outside debate. All the examples we give, for example, Spencer getting dead named at the award ceremony, the trend attacking that happened was in debate, the shit that happened in Texas, all prove that the fashion aspect of metabolism mobilized in the space of strictly question what we do with our time here now on case where they try to go for this cap turn. No, taking consider all the cap doubles on case. A, all the examples may prove that we are able to come up with these mechanisms to resist sort of material as they try to frame it. That was the example of de-arresting as a tax-free transitionality because we realized our face was entangled. But also the examples of We're the Ones Collective, which puts white folks on the front line to deal with sort of police interaction as a method to resist these violences. This should frame your argument because I understand how transitionality is sort of like exportable as an analytic and tax you see that altogether in and outside debate. Also, like Barn Dan Spencer and I put on B, no transitionality bad agents arguments because our argument is obligation entanglement. How we come to understand the value of reading it altogether. The conceded raw evidence proves that transitionality is a method to understand the unlearning argument and no micro-fascism arguments, even if you think there's some risk of it. The moralization double term argument I'm going to do on T proves the fascism offense, like proves the terms of fascism offense because they are worse.
They are the fascist ones.
They're the fascist ones in this debate. If you think it's a question of correcting against, then you vote for us. Cool, I'm friendly. Top level vote after endorse the Brexit transitionality. We're winning this season of the fashion aspect metabolism, which implicates us your flow because the question of how we mobilize this in this debate is a conceded uniqueness claim from the 2NR that we are in an era of fashion now, which means it's a question of how do we provide transmitted skills to resist when in the face of this violence, rising Trump, Kishkop, and countless anti-trans executive foreigners, etc. means we cannot see this space debating the interregnum means we need to resist. They say maximize fairness, but our arguments we need to maximize trans resistance because only we have unique offense about how both debate constructs this form of complicity, but also our model helps us resist that status quo. Thus, the counterinterpretation how to endorse methods of energy planning. All the KPK debates we've listened to the debate prove that such resistance is possible as good as well as the CEDA evidence which goes conceded. Don't let them lie to you, and that proves that our model is able to check all the internal links they try and go for on limited ground because we're able to provide a self-correcting community of the critical tradition that proves this resistance is both possible and good. It's a rhizomatic model of learning which uses voluntary limits. Read Cram Aspen's debate. It proves that the education tactics we learn through this are good. Filter all the impact debates through and interpretation through entanglement. The fashion affect of metabolism means don't do the work for them to disentangle the debate. The entire witness is a warrant for why we can't sing these things separately, which is also a reason why you cannot sing the case base and T separately, which is the offense that is going to turn the model. I mean, you vote after nothing else on the recognition of this entanglement. Here, the clearest moment that proves the tension between case and doubt is when the one is like the ass is bad because they said frameworks are trend that antagonistic, but it's actually anti-black. One, this can't be offense for them because they've considered anti-blackness inseparable from structure of the gender. Framing issue is the question how the voice even sound if we removed anti-blackness from reference. We literally could because entanglement is the context in which all our answers are right now denied the obligation to the end of the world that make anti-blackness possible, which mobilization creates and creates isolation. But two necessarily is offense for us because they spent 6 minutes happening, why the model debate is fantastic when it's endorsed, but this performative double speak is gross. It should prove that the fashion aspect of metabolism and what we do here and exceeds the mere sells the expression like how the 2 hour once you evaluate debate. Instead, you should always think through the context of debate, entanglement, and backdrop, which is the reason why to prefer interpretation. This is a type of conditional commitment and non-obligation that their model inevitably when they invoke the enemy black history framework and the 2 and T's and they fuck it in the 1 hour. Then say fuck it, never mind, because the model means we always conduct debate, but never say anything past the game that can't affect us. That is not inevitable because our model says that it should and can affect us because it is more than purely a game. It should give us the skills and compels us to stay entangled and it can, because that's the way outweighs the minor risk of fairness. Remember the way on line. You're going to risk a minor risk of fairness for an exponentially better education debate and a recurrent critical moment. Remember when the tutor explicitly said their model can't give us those skills because they don't feel it made us potential to. Now, the next argument here was fairness and prior. They can't win fairness and prior when we're winning both. This is the actualization of it in this debate because it's the implication of sort of fascist rhetoric that leads to the motivation impact I did above. Also means they can't win switch side in this debate because we're winning that. The double argument means switch side is the same form of separation of what the floods tell us in debate, what our entanglement world does, which teaches us to reinvest in the fashion aspect of metabolism because it can't let us understand how our struggles are entangled, which internally in terms of their ability to go for that. Look. It's a simple fucking debate. They've conceded a CEDA evidence plus competition and cooperation framing, which means crypto debate tradition works towards liberation that is able to resist. That means the counter-interpretation only has a risk of solving for their shit when they don't have risk of solving for ours because it's a performative way they deny entanglement implicates them up.
There's no ballot pick.
There's no ballot pick, which is the answer to the one they are.
Because the ballot can't result in a model result.
Because the ballot can't result in a model or resolve any form of fairness. The fairness paradox doesn't apply because we're winning, that what drives us is cooperation. We're in a unique critical moment. Y'all trying to change your intention. Stay entangled.
Good debate.